Hello everyone, Ben DiBono here for another foray into the Summa Theologica. We are continuing to take on the Trinity, which is turning out a bit more difficult and challenging than I had earlier promised, so sorry about that. I think this one, so today we're going to cover question 30 on the plurality of persons in God. And it's another challenging one. I don't think it's quite as tough as the divine persons, question 29. But there's definitely some stuff in there that is head scratching. And I was thinking about this a little bit, and part of what St. Thomas is doing, and he's of course a theologian in his own right. That should go without saying. He's a genius. But he's also, in some sense, trying to bring together a lot of the theology of the Trinity that the Church has embraced up to date. Or not up to date. Well, I don't mean like bring it up to date in the sense of updating it. I mean compile what the Church has done up until his time in terms of its work on the Trinity. So there's a lot of concepts that are being touched on in this treatise so far, especially it seems like in these last couple questions, that really he's not trying to treat in depth so much as he has just kind of hit them at a high level, and then the works that he references from Augustine, Boethius, Athanasius, the church councils would all be things that we're supposed to go read in further depth if we want to know more of what he's talking about. And I think that's an important thing to know, because you're not going to get the full concept from what he's saying. He's hitting it at a higher level than you would get if you go and read Augustine's De Trinitate, which is one of the most important works on the Trinity, and gets into a lot of these issues in a lot more detail than Aquinas is able to. So, I think that's important for us to understand, especially in parts where I, and probably you, though maybe not, might be confused. Okay? So without further ado, plurality of persons in God. 4 articles today. Whether there are several persons in God, whether there are more than 3 persons in God, whether the numeral terms, specifically plurality and unity, denote anything real in God, and then whether the term person can be common to the 3 persons. All right, so Article 1. Are there several persons in God? So first we're going to prove the possible existence of multiple persons in God, but without saying, how many that is. It could be 2, it could be infinity, okay? That's all this first article is trying to prove. So, objection. Since person is defined as the individual substance of a rational nature, which we saw in the last article, or last question, having multiple persons in God would require multiple substances, which cannot be. 2. A plurality of relations does not make a distinction of persons. That is the only plurality in God, as we saw in questions 27 and 28. Boethius says God is one and has no number. Plurality implies number. And then number 4, number requires whole and part. If there is whole and part in God, that violates his divine simplicity. But Athanasius is going to teach us, as well as the Church is going to teach us in its councils, that God is Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Okay. Argument. The previous question 29 of the divine persons, established that the word person in God signifies a relation in the divine nature. Question 28 established that there are several such relations, specifically 4, right? And then, taken together, these 2 points prove the existence of several persons in God. Okay, so because there's several relations in God, and because the word person in God signifies a relation in the divine nature, there therefore must be several persons in God. All right, so really just kind of restating the implications of the questions in this treatise up to date. Nothing too difficult yet, but don't worry, we'll get there. All right, Objections answered. Number one, the word substance in the definition of person does not mean essence but suppositum. We went over that last time in the definitions, but you can also check the Summa Theologica dictionary that I have, which is linked to in the video description. I've updated that with the definitions for hypostasis, suppositum, some of the other terms we talked about last week. So suppositum simply doesn't mean another essence. It means something that has its existence but not as part of another, I guess would be the right way to say that. Talked about that in more depth in the last video, so refer, rather than trying to restate what I talked about last time, I'll just refer you back there. Okay, number two, because the relative properties in God are subsisting, they are truly distinguished from each other, because suppositums, subsistences are distinguished from one another by nature. This is not true of creatures, hence the confusion in that objection. Number three, the simplicity of God excludes plurality of absolute things, but not of relations. Boethius teaches that point as well. And then number four, number is not in God in the sense of being a part of a whole, but in an intellectual sense, and that'll be explained more later. He refers to like question 42 or something, so we got a ways to go before we get to that one. And Lord knows if we'll actually remember that issue by then. Okay, so there are several persons in God, but are there three persons in God? How do we arrive at that number then? You know, why don't we say there are two? Why don't we say there are four? Why don't we say there are infinite? All right, the plurality of persons comes from the plurality of relations. Question 28 taught us that there are four relations in God. Therefore, there are four persons. Those four relations, just to give you a refresher, would be paternity, filiation, spiration, and procession. Okay. Again, go back to question 28 for more info on those. Here I think especially we're starting to see Aquinas really building his argument on previous questions. So important to at least, if not a perfect understanding, at least a high-level knowledge of some of these concepts he's talking about. Number two, the nature of God is no more different from his intellect than from his will, since one person, the Son, proceeds from the will, and another proceeds from his nature, since one person, the Spirit, proceeds from the will, and another, that would be the Son or the Word, proceeds from his nature, there must be another who proceeds from his intellect. In addition to the Father, this means there are more than three persons in God. So, these first two objections, why don't we have a quadrinity instead of a trinity? Right? Okay, number three, the more perfect a creature is, the more interior operations it has, such things like will, nature, intellect, etc. Since God is the most perfect, he has an infinite number of operations and thus an infinite number of persons in him. So we have an infinitary, not an infantry. I'm trying to combine the words infinite and trinity, and I don't think that actually works. Okay, moving on. Number four, the processions come from the Father because of his infinite goodness. We talked about the processions, questions 27, 28. The infinite goodness is also in the Spirit. So why doesn't the Spirit have its own relations? And then on to infinity. So again, there should be infinite persons in God. Then the Creed of Athanasius describes the Father, Son, and Spirit as immense, and things that are immense can't be contained in the number three, which is one of those numerological questions that I think feels pretty esoteric to a modern mind, but, that's where we have to, even if we don't really see the importance of it, in order to be chronologically humble, I think we have to admit that maybe, there's things that were important in the past and aren't important now, and vice versa. And so a well-rounded view of philosophy, theology, humanities requires us to accept the importance of even esoteric things like that make us kind of scratch our heads, even when we don't quite get it. All right. Argument from authority. Well, 1 John 5:7 speaks of the Father, the Word, the Son, and the Holy Ghost only, and the teaching of the Church confirms that. The argument. Persons in God can only arise from subsisting relations distinct from each other. Something we've already established, so again, we're kind of dealing with the implications of previous questions. Two opposite relations require two persons at each end of the relations. Thus, paternity and filiation refer to the Father and the Son. Spiration belongs to the Father and the Son, since there is no opposition between them in this. He explains that a little bit more In the argument, if you want to go read it yourself, if you want to go read it yourself, essentially what he's trying to deal with there, let me just, and then on the other end of that, is procession, which belongs to the Spirit. What he's essentially trying to deal with there is you have this issue of, okay, the Father or the Son is begotten by the Father. And then the Spirit proceeds from the Father, but then what's the relation of the Spirit to the Son? And so what the church has done, and this is one of those issues where I think to really get more than a high-level understanding of it, we have to maybe dig into some of the other Trinitarian literature out there. But what the church has taught is that the procession of the Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. Now, there is an important distinction here between Eastern theology and the Eastern Orthodox churches and Western theology in Catholic and Protestant churches, where in the West, and if you read the Nicene Creed, as it's stated in Western churches, if you're in a Protestant tradition that says it on a regular basis, or if you're Catholic where it's said at every Mass, that it says in the Creed, the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Now, the East is going to say the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son. Again, might seem like an esoteric, unimportant distinction from us. I don't want to get into why that distinction is there, because again, we're not studying extra Trinitarian literature here, and it's way too complicated for me to try and just kind of summarize off of my memory from reading some of those a while back. But suffice to say that there's some differences there between the East and West, but yet both Christianity as a whole would agree that the Father and the Son have a role in the spiration of the Spirit. And so it's confusing, but that relationship goes from the Father and the Son to the Spirit. And how exactly that works, it's and some of this comes down to the fact that you have the Father, you have the Son, and then you have the love that is between them, and that's the Spirit, which Aquinas kind of alluded to previously in this treatise. Getting complicated stuff. I'm probably going to stop it there, because otherwise I'm just going to start confusing myself and everyone listening. But again, I would refer you to Augustine's De Trinitate, which has a lot of good, though complicated stuff on this topic, and it's one of the most important works. And of course, it's also worth reading some of the Eastern Fathers to understand that side of things as well. Those of us in the West, our theology can become fairly insular on this point. But I think a good spirit of ecumenism and Christian charity should compel us to want to study both sides of this very old and very important debate. All right, objections answered then. Number one, because spiration belongs to both the Father and the Son, there are only three relations. In other words, if we don't have some kind of joining there, then you could make the case that there should be four persons. Number two, question 27 explained how that which proceeds by intelligence proceeds according to similitude of that which proceeds by nature. Very confusing sentence. Go back to question 27. Thus, the procession from the intellect and nature of the Word is the same. That's really what it boils down to, is that he's just kind of explaining that no, that doesn't really follow, that there would be another procession from the intellect. Okay, number three, this is true in creatures because our perfection is composite, so the more perfect we are as composite creatures, the more internal operations before. But for simple creatures, or simpler creatures like angels and then ultimately God, of course, the opposite is true. And so God, his perfection is simple, and there's only one internal operation in him because he's wholly simple. All right, number four, this objection would only be true if the Spirit's goodness was distinct from the Father's, and it's not. So there isn't this infinite procession. And then number three, when we speak of number in God, we're not speaking of measurement. Again, kind of an esoteric point. Be aware that it's there. Appreciate it, but don't get too stressed out if it doesn't make perfect sense, because it's not something that really clicks with our culture as much. All right. Article 3, whether the numeral terms, unity, plurality, denote anything real in God. Okay, objections. Every number in God is the unity of God repeated. His unity is his essence, thus every numeral term refers to his essence and is real. This is a very esoteric question. A little bit at the beginning, but it's going to have some important distinctions. I'm not going to be able to claim I understand everything he's getting at here, but stick around. It's going to be important, okay? At least in a mysterious, confusing sort of way. Number 2, numeral terms denote something real in creatures, therefore how much more must they denote something real in God? And if the numeral terms are used in a negative sense, then a vicious circle is formed in which plurality is introduced in God to remove unity, and unity introduced to remove plurality. Or let's stop there for just a second. So we've talked about negative theology before. Negative theology doesn't say anything positive about God. That's not in the sense of like, oh, you bad God or anything like that. It's in the sense of that when we start talking about God, we're talking about a being beyond our comprehension. And so to be able to describe God, we have a very difficult time describing what he is. And oftentimes we have to instead describe what he is not. And so we rule out this, we rule out that, we rule out that. And so what Aquinas is going to say in this article, and what this objection is trying to preempt, is that maybe we use the term unity to rule out the idea that there are multiple gods. And maybe we're using the term plurality to rule out the idea that there can't be these multiple persons to protect the Trinity. I think the argument from authority explains it well. So Hilary tells us that plurality is admitted to exclude the notion of solitude in God. No, there is real community in God. There's real relation in God. And so we're excluding the idea. We can't quite explain how that works, but we're going to exclude the notion that God is all alone, and, that there's no real relation in him, and we're going to exclude that idea using the term plurality. And then Ambrose tells us that unity is introduced to exclude a plurality of gods. So hence both unity and plurality are used in a negative sense and not to denote something real or positive. So essentially, the way to look at this is that unity and plurality, when we use these terms of God, if we say we're using them in a positive sense, it feels like they start to contradict really fast. But it's almost like unity forms a border or a protection against this issue. Plurality forms a protection against this issue. And we're going to see in a minute how those don't really contradict when we're taking them in that, understanding them in that sense. All right. So plurality involves division, and division can be taken in two terms. There's material division, in which division can go on infinitely. You just keep chopping something in half. Transcendental division, in which plurality is caused by immaterial opposites and doesn't actually, even though we use the word division there, doesn't actually divide something. It's more plurality caused by opposition, not in the sense of we're against each other, but in the sense of this kind of relational opposition we've talked about in the Trinity thus far. Only the second type, transcendental division, which again, immaterial opposites, applies to God. Right? God isn't corporeal, so we can't divide him materially. And so whatever type of division or plurality is in him, and that's probably the better way to say it would be transcendental plurality, isn't a dividing him in the sense where now we have two gods. It's the sense of there's something in God, the relations, the processions we've talked about, that have an opposition to one another. Not in a sense of being against each other, but just in the Father and the Son, right? Transcendental division is not true division, but is metaphorical, meaning that it signifies multiplicity within undivided unity. This is where our brains start to explode, everyone, so just buckle your seatbelts. Thus, God's essence is one in the sense that it is undivided, and the persons are one in the sense that they are undivided in their individual subsistences. Okay. So God's oneness, actually, let's keep going through the objections, because there's a bit more here I want to draw on, and then I will try and sum this up as best I can. It is very complicated. So do not worry if you don't get it. I don't get it all. Okay? Objections answered. Reply to number one. One, considered transcendentally, goes beyond substance and relation. It adds a negation of division, but does not import anything real. So God is undivided. When we say God is one, that God is wholly simple, that God is unity, we mean God is undivided. On the other hand, multitude can be applied to God in the way, or cannot be applied to God in the way that it is to creatures, but only transcendental multitude, which adds indivision to the multitude. Okay? What does that mean? Well, it means that the multitude, in this case the multitude of persons, relations in God, are an indivisible multitude. Taken transcendentally, this is number three, one does not exclude multitude, but only division. Similarly, transcendental multitude does not remove unity, but only division of the individuals which compose the multitude. Okay. We are at the limits of my understanding, probably at the limits of your understanding, but I think that we are approaching the limits of what humans can say about the mystery of the Trinity. Well, this is one attempt to explain it. And what Aquinas is saying is that God is one. He's not composite parts. But within his oneness, within his simplicity, there's the multitude of persons, which, rather than being composite parts, are a transcendental multitude, which means they are indivisible in themselves and indivisible as a multitude. Now, is it possible to really, or maybe it's possible, but are we able to really explain more than that what that means? Maybe not. It's very confusing, but I think you can kind of start to see what he's getting at. And the key idea here is that we're ruling things out because there's this big thing in the center, God, which we can't explain because God by definition is inexplicable, and the Trinity is by definition a divine mystery. But when we apply a transcendental unity to God, we are saying God is one. He is indivisible, right? Because we're ruling out the idea that God, like we set up here, that there's multiple gods. No, there's one God. When we say that God has plurality or transcendental multitude in him, we are ruling out the idea that there aren't real relations in God, that he isn't Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And while we might not be able to grasp how that mystery actually works with what is left over, what we are doing is ruling out enough so that we can say this is what the doctrine of the Trinity teaches us. Okay? Very confusing. So don't stress it. And don't even worry about trying to understand it necessarily. Be aware that it's there, and be aware that in the early centuries of the church, this was a really big deal. This was a really big deal. And that parts of our doctrine we take for granted today, we're able to do so because people in the early centuries of the church spent, their lifetimes figuring this stuff out and really dealing with it in a concrete way. Okay? All right. Whether the term person can be common to the three persons. Objections. Nothing common to the three persons. Nothing is common to the three persons but the divine essence. Therefore, the term person is not common. The common is the opposite of the incommunicable. The definition of person includes that it is incommunicable. Number three, if the term person is common to them really, it would mean they are one person. If it is common to them logically, it would be a universal in God. There is nothing universal or particular. Argument from authority. Well, we use the term person because, as Augustine says, when we talk about there being three in God, we naturally ask three what, and person kind of becomes our placeholder for that answer for that question. Again, De Trinitate is the place to go to get even more confused on that point. All right. Argument. The expression three persons itself proves that person is common to the three. Just as when we say three men, we are saying that man is common to the three. So it's simply illogical to say that if we're saying three persons, the person must be common to the three. Okay, the community of persons is not a real thing, as though one essence was common to all three, since this would result in there being only one person. It's a little confusing the way he words it, and I didn't do a good job of improving on it. Yes, there's one divine essence that all three partake in, but what he's saying is kind of this idea up here that, if we say that it's a real thing, it's, there's three real persons, it would mean, but that there's only one divine essence, it would mean that there's only one person, but yet it's this logical, man, I'm not doing well explaining this because I don't fully understand it, but it's more of a logical relationship than a, three people type of thing. I don't know. I don't know. Some of these I just have to admit that I do the best I can to summarize, but it's probably grossly inadequate. All right, we use the term person for the three in order to indicate that each of them subsists distinctly from the others in the divine nature. Okay, that's more of what I was trying to get at. See, I should have just kept reading. So when we say three persons, we don't mean that there's person A with his own nature, or the Father with his own nature, the Son with his own nature, and the third with his own nature, because that would contradict God's divine simplicity. And so if we say, well, there's one nature, there's one essence in God, and then there's the Father, who really is his own person, since the word person implies a distinct nature, an individual nature, we say there's really the Son with his own real person, and there's the Spirit with his own real person. Well, then, we've kind of contradicted ourselves, and we either have to violate God's divine simplicity or say that there's only one person. But what we're saying is that within the divine nature, that one singular nature, there are three subsistences. We can't quite explain how that works, but that's what we mean when we talk of there being three persons. So again, to go back to the argument of authority, person isn't a perfect term. There is no perfect term. It's that there's three what? There's three in God. Well, three what? We say persons. We could say subsistences. No one would know what we're talking about. We could say hypostases. Nobody would know what we're talking about. There's a number of words we could maybe plug in there, all of them imperfect in their own way. Okay? And then the objection's answered. Number one, the objection implies real community, which is what we're kind of just proving above. And then the person is incommunicable, but the term is not. And then number three, the community of persons is logical, but this does not mean that there is something universal or particular in God, since the three persons have one being. Again, kind of a confusing objection, but we'll just roll with it. All right, and so next time, then, it looks like we're going to get into more of unity and plurality in God. So again, I apologize if some of this isn't clear. I'm doing the best I can. I'm not an expert at this. I have some expertise, but that's very different than being an expert. And some of this is just very confusing. Some of this is stuff where you can spend your whole career on and still feel like you're barely scratching the surface. The church has spent centuries on this, so which isn't meant to excuse any flaws in my part, in my inability to explain perfectly, but maybe to excuse a little bit the fact, or ask for a bit of grace, that hey, if the church has struggled for understanding the Trinity for centuries and centuries, maybe we can explain why Ben Bono isn't able to perfectly summarize it in a 20-minute YouTube video. All right, so that's it for today's video. We'll be back with question 31 in a day or two. Until then, I'm Ben Bono, and I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.